Hi, I'm Hal Roberts. This is Bridge City News. Here's some of the top stories we've been following. Around 11 million Canadians receive some financial help from the federal government to help offset the cost of rising groceries. In retaliation to Meta blocking Canadian content with Ottawa's new Online Act legislation, the federal government is now pulling ads from both Facebook and Instagram. And we hear from the Better Business Bureau, which explains why Canadians are not giving as much to charities as they used to.
Your nation, your province, your southern Alberta. From the heart of Lethbridge, it's Bridge City News with Hal Roberts.
Thanks so much for joining us. Canadians eligible for the GST credit were to receive a special payment today to help with the rising cost of groceries. The payment, which the Liberals are calling the grocery rebate, was promised in the spring budget. The Canada Revenue Agency says around 11 million eligible Canadians will receive the money alongside the regular GST credit payment. Couples with 2 kids will receive up to an extra $467. Single Canadians without children will receive an additional $234, while seniors will receive an extra $225 on average. Now, Canada's inflation rate slowed to 3.4% in May, but prices at the grocery store continue to climb. They're up 9% compared to a year ago. Groups representing Canadian businesses want Ottawa to intervene in the ongoing labour strike at BC ports. Canadian manufacturers and exporters say designating ports and rail lines as essential infrastructure would help provide manufacturers with the stability they need. The Greater Vancouver Board of Trade is asking the federal government to use every tool at its disposal to end the strike, including potential back-to-work legislation. Meanwhile, Alberta Transport Minister Devin Durishan wants the federal government to recall Parliament to consider back-to-work legislation to end the strike at BC ports once and for all. The strike by more than 7,000 workers at ports across the province is now in its 5th day. Talks between the two sides stalled on Monday. Canada's Heritage Minister Pablo Rodriguez discussed ongoing efforts to implement Bill C-18, which is the federal government's new Online News Act. The legislation would require tech companies like Meta and Google to pay for Canadian news content on their platforms. The web giants have indicated they'll block the news content for Canadian users in response, which will hurt a number of media outlets, including us right here at Bridge City News.
We're talking about 2 huge platforms that are using content from our journalists, from our news organizations, profiting off their ads, and watching journalism decline as they eat up huge revenue. As a matter of fact, 80% of the ad revenue is going to those 2 companies. In 2022, last year, that represented almost $10 billion. So we've met with both Google and Meta multiple times to better understand their concerns. We believe we have a path forward, and we're willing to continue talking with the platforms without going into details, because we don't negotiate in public, but we're deeply convinced that Google's concerns will be resolved through regulations. In the meantime, and this is very clear, the platforms don't have any obligations under the Act, none. And despite this, Facebook has decided to be unreasonable, irresponsible, and started blocking news.
So in response, Minister Rodriguez says the Canadian government will suspend ads on both Facebook and Instagram. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau was in Montreal delivering a keynote speech at the International Council of Nurses Congress. Trudeau says nurses in Canada and around the world continue to be the backbone of any healthcare system.
You form a collaborative team with other health professionals. You are tireless advocates for patients. You have great communication skills, and you know how to adapt to different situations. You help people, but also their families, cope with illness. And you use your holistic knowledge and skills to promote the health and well-being, not just of individuals, but of entire communities. During the pandemic, we spent a lot of time telling you that you were heroes, because you are true heroes.
It appears as though Alberta Premier Daniel Smith is trying to smooth over the rough waters with Ottawa. According to our legislative reporter Tyler Dawson, our Premier has been meeting with federal government officials expressing Alberta's concerns, and the meetings have been going fairly well.
Now, there was a meeting in the last week or two between Premier Smith and some federal government ministers, Dominic LeBlanc, the Intergovernmental Affairs Minister, I believe, and Jonathan Wilkinson, the Natural Resources Minister. And the outcome of those meetings seemed to be largely positive. Politicians rarely come out of a meeting and say it went horrible and they hate each other and wish they'd been able to throw a cup of coffee in their face. But take what you will from people saying that they went well.
Tyler Dawson will also talk about how government officials are trying to address the overdose crisis here in our province. He'll have details coming up after business news. The Alberta government signed memorandums of understanding with the Tsuut'ina Nation to increase addiction treatment capacity on First Nations lands. Mental Health and Addiction Minister Dan Williams says the province will continue to work with Indigenous communities to offer the best support available. That includes a new 75-bed unit for those who are battling addictions.
So this idea of recovery community is something that plays an important part in our continuum of care in Alberta and how we are choosing to respond to the addiction crisis that's plaguing so many of our communities. And the idea of it being a recovery community is very important. They offer holistic, community-centered, long-term treatment for those suffering from addiction and a supportive environment with what they need. They can stay for up to 1 year at this facility, and we're hoping that we're able to have this underway in early 2024 and completion hopefully soon after that, so we can see members of this community and those across the entire region able to get those supports that are so badly needed so that they can deal with the crisis on their hands, they get the support from the government and their families and their community, and get their lives back on track.
Drugs have always been with us in every community, but the reality and the severity of drug abusing is changing. It has already changed. When I was growing up and then became a member of council at Tsuut'ina, there was substance abuse. Of course there was. In this generation, we are dealing not just with alcohol or soft drugs, we are dealing with synthetic opioids that are cheap and easy to conceal and incredibly powerful.
Well, we had lots of cloud cover today and even some light showers in parts of southwestern Alberta. Angela Stewart is here now with an early peek at the forecast. Angela, we may see a little more rain before things start to clear up.
Yeah, a little bit, not much though. We'll probably see about a 30% chance of rain tomorrow. And then as the weekend comes and makes its way and then into mid next week, that's when we're going to be shooting back up into those hot, humid temperatures around those low mid 30s. Tonight sitting at a low of 10. As I mentioned, risk of a thunderstorm, so that moisture also going to be seeing that risk of that tomorrow. Reaching a high of 27 expected for tomorrow and then sitting at a low of 10. As for how the rest of the week is shaping up, I'll have all those details coming up later on in the show.
Great. Thanks so much, Angela. Alberta NDP finance critic Shannon Phillips wants Premier Daniel Smith and the UCP to, quote, come clean about their goal of potentially pulling our province out of the Canada Pension Plan. A recent poll from Leger says only 21% of Albertans are in favor of replacing the CPP with an Alberta version. Phillips says she's hoping for transparency from Smith and the province moving forward.
The Premier should just come out right now and say yes or no. It's time to end the speculation. That is also bad for the CPP and their ability to plan and make investment decisions for the $500 billion of assets they have under management around the world. Staying in the CPP, we can contribute to the strength and stability of all of the province's pension system. This isn't Ottawa's pension system. The CPP is a creature of the provinces.
Now, Bridge City News reached out to the office of Finance Minister Nate Horner for comment on the story, and we received a statement which in part reads, the Premier has been very clear, no one is taking away Albertans' pensions. We're waiting for the final report from LifeWorks, formerly known as Morneau Chapelle. Once that report is final and our government has had an opportunity to review it, we will release it to the public. If Albertans make it clear they would like to have a referendum on establishing an Alberta pension plan, we will do so. Farmers market season kicked off on Wednesday in the downtown core. Lethbridge and District Exhibition has partnered with the Downtown BRZ to bring the farmers market to Festival Square. Around 20 vendors will be in the area showcasing their products for the entire summer.
Over the course of a year, we deal with 200 or so independent farmers market vendors who, to your point, this is their opportunity to show their wares, to show what they've created, to sample that food product, you name it. And so it's such an important part in, and I mentioned it last week in the food security conversation. here in southern Alberta and what we can play on a more global scheme. And so to have this connection point with local producers is such an important thing.
Reminds me I need to get some fresh vegetables. By the way, the downtown Lethbridge Farmers Market will run every Wednesday from 9 a.m. till 2 p.m. in Festival Square. Beginning this fall, curling will become a full-time sport at the University of Lethbridge. Casey Scheidegger has been announced as the new head coach for the men's and women's pronghorn curling programs. Scheidegger comes to the U of L with a lot of experience. She has several Grand Slam titles under her belt, including the Canadian Open Championship, the Players' Championship, and the Tour Challenge. She has also participated in multiple Scottish Tournament of Hearts events representing Alberta. According to new research from the Better Business Bureau's Give.org, a large number of people surveyed have stopped donating to charities. The report collected data from more than 2,100 adults in the U.S. and over 1,000 people here in Canada. It found that people who make a household income of $70,000 or less thought that wealthier residents should be giving more to charities. Wes LaFortune with the Southern Alberta BBB detailed a few of the key findings within the report.
People are having a hard time, financially, and so they're being careful with their money, and that, I think, contributes to where they're supporting and perhaps being reticent to support charities. And another key point is that folks are looking for diversity from charities and transparency. So is there people from diverse backgrounds on the boards and working for the charities and so on?
And more information on the report can be found on our website, bridgecitynews.ca. South of the border, government officials in Philadelphia have condemned the recent gun attack in their city. 5 people were killed and 2 others were wounded earlier this week when a 40-year-old shooter opened fire in a residential neighborhood.
This country needs to re-examine its conscience and find out how to get guns out of dangerous people's hands. A person walking down a city street with an AR-style rifle and shooting randomly at people while wearing a bulletproof vest with multiple magazines is a disgraceful but all too common situation in America. And I was today at Independence Hall where they wrote that Constitution, and the Second Amendment was never intended to protect this.
It is disgusting that you can go to New Jersey and find a whole list of reasonable gun regulation that we don't have, that you can go to Delaware and there's almost as long a list of reasonable gun legislation that we don't have. Some of that legislation might have made a difference here.
Meanwhile, a special memorial was held remembering the 7 people who lost their lives following a mass shooting in Highland Park, Illinois. Friends and families gathered together, thinking of the lives which were lost a year ago.
Last summer's shooting was the bloodiest day we've ever experienced in Highland Park. 7 precious people were senselessly murdered, dozens more horrifically injured, and thousands were traumatized by a hateful and cowardly individual who opened fire with an assault weapon during a uniquely American holiday parade. We don't need the date or the holiday to remind us about what happened. We live with it every day. Each one of us, even as the world moves on, the loss and the pain will never leave us.
In light of the many mass shootings south of the border, U.S. President Joe Biden is calling once again for gun reform. He also says more needs to be done to better protect students and teachers at schools from gun violence.
As you know, all too well, educators now find themselves in the front lines of gun violence. Some of your members talked about it, Jill talked about it. With your help, we passed the most significant bipartisan gun safety legislation in 30 years, but it's not nearly enough. I was one of those guys early on when I was a senator who helped pass the assault weapons ban. We could only get it for 10 years, and one of the Republican administrations got rid of it. But Congress needs to step up, pass common sense gun safety laws to protect our kids and educators. And by the way, arming teachers is not the answer.
A team from Great Commission Media Ministries narrowly escaped with their lives while delivering aid supplies in eastern Ukraine. They came within 100 meters of being hit by Russian missiles. The team thanked God for his protection as they delivered much-needed food packs and gospel booklets to families in need. Peter Wooding from the Global News Alliance has more.
Despite coming within just 100 meters of Russian missile attacks, a team with Great Commission Media Ministries has continued to distribute vital aid to families in the Donetsk region of East Ukraine. This is the moment just after they came under fire, and minutes later they continued with their aid distribution. Here you can hear the voice of the ministry's John Hauke explaining the importance of continuing their work.
Well, look at this, folks. Look at this. This is what we do. This is what Gennady and his men do every day here. They are taking huge risks, but they love these people and they also love the Russians, but we need to help these people because they're defenseless. And here's one way we can do it. We can just send as much aid as possible.
And GCMM founder and CEO Hannu Hauke explains more about the vital food packs they're providing, which also come with gospel booklets.
And in this particular bag we'll have rice, we'll have macaroni, we'll have canned goods, canned meat, and we'll have flour, we'll have some kind of spice maybe for the food. So it's a ration. One bag will probably be good enough for this family maybe for maybe a week, possibly.
They've also provided 6,000 wood-burning stoves throughout the region. Hannu visits the home of one of the families benefiting from one of these stoves.
They have just finished cooking a meal. You can see that they have the frying pan, they've got the tea kettle on. And without this particular wood-burning stove, they would not be cooking a meal, and they would not be boiling water either. So for many families, it is a life-saving device.
And despite the ongoing war and dangers they face, Great Commission Media Ministries will continue to serve the many families impacted by the conflict in East Ukraine. Peter Wooding reporting for the Global News Alliance.
Great to see Christians doing amazing work in Ukraine once again. A pastor and his wife, who's a former marriage counselor, wrote a book on how to improve your marriage. Brad and Marilyn Rhodes co-authored The Grace Marriage. In an interview with BCN's Jeanette Rocher, Brad Rhodes explained the difference between a performance-based marriage versus a grace-based one.
Well, a performance-based marriage is really dependent on the performance of both parties. So if like, say I'm cold, say I'm stressed at work, having a hard day, and I come home and I'm distant and detached. In a performance-based marriage, Miriam withdraws from me. She's not nice to me. She's like, if you're going to treat me that way, I'm just going to withdraw from you or give you a consequence. Like how she treats me is dependent on how I'm doing day to day. And so it's based on performance. In a grace-based marriage, it's just, I love you. I love you when you do well. I love you when you don't do well. I love you when you're struggling. I love you when you're thriving.
Make sure you catch the full interview with the Rhodes as they discuss their book, The Grace Marriage, coming up in the second half of our show. Well, we had kind of a mixed bag today weather-wise, and that trend will continue for the short term. Full weather details are on deck. We had lots of clouds and even some light showers in parts of southwestern Alberta today. Angela Stewart is here now with a complete look at the forecast. Angela, even though some areas in our region are seeing some much needed moisture, the temperatures are really not cooling off very much, are they?
Yeah, you're exactly right, Hal. We won't be cooling off much, but there is a chance that we might see some rain, or we might not see any at all. Tomorrow there is a risk of a thunderstorm, about a 30% chance. Otherwise, we're still going to be reaching up into those high 20s, 27 expected for tomorrow. And then as the weekend carries on into the rest of the week, that's when we're going to be shooting up into those low 30s, 26, 27 for Friday, Saturday. And then as I mentioned, going back into next week, 31, 30, and 31 degrees for Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday. So it's going to be very warm next week. Our average high for this time of year is 25 degrees. Our average low is 10. Highest temperature was 36 degrees recorded back in 2007. Lowest temperature was 4 degrees back in 2003. Our sun rose at 5:31 this morning and expected to set at 9:41, so that puts us at about 16 hours and exactly 10 minutes of daylight. Temperatures across the country now for Thursday, Vancouver and Victoria. It's going to be feeling slightly cooler near the water, near the Juan de Fuca Strait. Going to be feeling about 24 there, but lots of sunshine otherwise. Mix of sun and cloud in Vancouver. And then Edmonton, Calgary, they're both under a risk of a thunderstorm, so both of those cities might be feeling some moisture tomorrow. 26, 23 expected for Calgary and Edmonton. In Saskatchewan, now there's also a risk of a thunderstorm in some areas there. Saskatoon and Regina, risk of a thunderstorm there, as I mentioned, reaching low mid-30s tomorrow. To the rest of the prairies, 26. And, you know, they're going to be feeling some reprieve in Winnipeg because they've been feeling very humid lately. Heat warnings in the central part of the country for all of Ottawa, Toronto, and Montreal. Toronto is kind of where they're going to be seeing that risk of a thunderstorm as well. So otherwise, it's still going to be very hot. This heat warning, we're not sure as to how long it's going to be lasting for, but it is expected to last up for the next few days. There's also a heat warning for some parts of Atlantic Canada, specifically in Fredericton. 30 degrees expected there tomorrow, so that's when you need to be keeping in mind, take as many breaks as you can, stay hydrated. Halifax, Charlottetown, and St. John's, low to mid-20s, 28, 24, and 23 in St. John's. Gonna still be seeing some moisture, hazy in parts in some of these areas too. And that is your full weather forecast.
Not only is the federal government pulling all of its ads from Facebook and Instagram, but so is Quebecor. It's in response to Meta's plan to block Canadian news from its sites. The owner of Videotron, TVA Group, and various newspapers says any move by Meta to circumvent Canadian law, blocks news for its users, or discriminate against Canadian media content on its platforms cannot be tolerated. Meta made the move in response to federal legislation requiring Google and Meta to pay news publishers for content that appears on their sites if it helps them generate money. Both Meta and Google have said they would remove Canadian news from their platforms to avoid having to compensate news outlets, including Bridge City News. Nearly 2,000 Air Canada flights were cancelled or delayed over the Canada Day long weekend. Figures from aviation tracker FlightWare show that around half of all trips by the country's biggest airline were disrupted Saturday through Monday. That includes lower-cost Air Canada Rouge and regional partner Jazz Aviation. As for WestJet, Air Transat, and Flair Airlines, they all registered lower flight disruption levels. Contract talks have broken down between United Parcel Service and the union representing 340,000 of its workers. Each side is blaming the other for walking away from the talks. The current contract expires on July the 31st. UPS workers voted for strike authorization last month, with Union Chief Sean O'Brien saying last week that a strike was imminent. If a strike happens, it would be the first since a 15-day walkout by 185,000 workers crippled the company 25 years ago. Now, here's a look at today's markets. The TSX was down 100 points on the day to finish at 20,103. The Dow was down 129 points to 34,288. The S&P 500 was down 8 points on the day to 4446, and the Nasdaq was down 25 points to 13,791. West Texas Intermediate Oil was up 203 to 71.82 US per barrel. Natural gas was down 6 cents to 265 US. Gold was down a cent to 19.1529 US an ounce, and silver was also down a cent to 23.10 US an ounce. Feed wheat is at $11.02 per bushel, barley's at $9.04, canola's at $17.06, and corn is at $9.78 per bushel. Live cattle August contract was down $1.88 to $174.95. Feeder cattle August contract was down $3.20 to $244.70, and lean hogs July contract was up $3.45 to $101.28. The Canadian dollar was down slightly over the past 24 hours to 75.27 US. Recapping one of our top stories, the federal government's new grocery rebate should have arrived in your bank account. That is, if you're one of the 11 million eligible Canadians. The Canada Revenue Agency says the extra money does not include the regular GST credit payment. Couples with 2 kids will receive up to an extra $467. Single Canadians without kids will receive an additional $234, while seniors will receive an extra $225 on average. Preston Manning headed up a panel looking into the handling of the COVID-19 pandemic. The interim report was due on June the 30th. We shall chat with our legislative reporter Tyler Dawson shortly to find out if any of the findings have been released as of yet. Listen, if you see news happening in your community, be sure to drop us an email at info@bridgecitynews.ca. We'd love to hear from you. There appears to be a little infighting taking place within the ranks of Take Back Alberta. This is the group that takes credit for taking down Jason Kenney as leader of the UCP. Now, to chat about this in more detail is our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent with the National Post, Tyler Dawson, who joins us once again from Edmonton. Tyler, Take Back Alberta has power among the party's grassroots, and around half of the UCP board members are aligned with them. But the leader, David Parker, went on a Twitter rant calling on the party president, Cynthia Moore, to step down?
Yeah, he had quite a lengthy thread saying that she was a tyrant and things like that. And part of what is going on here is a fight over the cost of the UCP convention and whether or not it's out of reach for sort of your average UCP member. So there is actually sort of an issue at play here. But this does seem to have led to some infighting within Take Back Alberta, with some people saying that this sort of extremely combative approach isn't the one that's going to lead to change within the party, and therefore changes within some of the government priorities and things like that. Infighting for the United Conservatives is nothing new at this point. We spent a year and a half really talking about Jason Kenney's trouble with the grassroots, including the Take Back Alberta people. And so it does seem like there might be a little bit of friction within the party that Danielle Smith is going to have to deal with as well. So in that sense, this isn't unusual. But Take Back Alberta is given a lot of credit, as you mentioned, for taking down Jason Kenney. And there are certainly some people who see them as sort of this shadowy force behind Danielle Smith's premiership. And while that's probably not entirely true, it is true that they do have some sort of mobilization power and have a number of board members aligned with them, and therefore could influence party policy. So, I think this might be one of those things that simmers a bit over the summer. Maybe it goes away, but probably where we'll see if any of this sort of matters is going to be at the next UCP convention, when there will be another set of elections for board members, and presumably Take Back Alberta will once again have a slate of candidates. And so we'll see what power basically that they really wield at that point.
Premier Danielle Smith met with the other Western premiers in Whistler, BC recently. Tyler, they talked about a lot of things, but most importantly, it appears as though all of the premiers were in agreement with Premier Danielle Smith when it comes to resource development.
Yeah, so they all sort of got together, the premiers of BC, Alberta, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Nunavut, Northwest Territories, and the Yukon, just to sort of, talk out Western priorities. And one of the things that did come up was that Western resource development can't be sort of crushed, I guess, is maybe too strong of a way to put it, but can't be sort of damaged by the federal government's environmental priorities. And of course, this isn't just Alberta's oil and gas industry. This is British Columbia's gas industry, British Columbia's logging industry. You've got mining in Saskatchewan. You've got mining up north. So it's a slightly broader range of industries, perhaps, than Albertans are used to thinking about in this context. But, you do have agreement from the Western premiers that there needs to be a focus on economic development and maintenance in addition to the climate. So, it was interesting because it was a fairly a fairly calm and collected sort of communique statement that the premiers put out. It didn't have any of the sort of fire spitting that Albertans are maybe accustomed to seeing from their premiers, and that people in Saskatchewan are accustomed to seeing as well. So you could argue that it was a bit of a different tone for Smith, but of course she was part of a group of people issuing a statement, not just her. So hard to say exactly what that means for her attitude towards the federal government going forward.
Preston Manning has been heading up a panel looking into the handling of the COVID-19 pandemic, Tyler, and making recommendations for any changes that might improve things if we ever go through another pandemic. Now, the interim report was due on June the 30th. What do we know at this point about its findings?
Well, nothing. And part of the reason why we know nothing is that the government isn't releasing the interim report. So the final report is due, I believe, November 15th, but it's November at any rate. And they've said that they're not going to be releasing it prior to that date. And so this actually is the practice they've used in the past on some of their other panel consultations and reports. But it would be sort of nice to know what Preston Manning has found. Yeah. Of course, his appointment was fairly controversial. The NDP said that he had no expertise in the matter, and that he was had ideological views that were going to sort of predetermine the outcome of his inquiry. And so actually we have no way to judge that at this point either. So not only do we not know what the recommendations are, we don't know whether or not the government's confidence in him and the opposition's lack of confidence in him if either of those were validated, neither or both of them potentially.
The province recently announced $175 million to help communities recovering from the wildfires. We've seen so many of them so far this summer and in the spring, Tyler. Now, can you explain in detail what the $175 million will be going towards?
Right. So, there's all sorts of costs that come with a wildfire. There's overtime for municipal staff that are working on evacuations. There's firefighter wages. There's the actual costs of evacuations if a municipality, has to charter boats or planes or buses or something like that. So the cost will go to things like that municipalities had to shoulder, and they will also go towards some sort of rebuilding and infrastructure costs, so repairs to damaged infrastructure from the wildfires, and also potentially some of this money could go towards building fire barriers and other infrastructure that actually makes some of these places more fire resistant in the future. So that's sort of what that pot of money is looking at, and I think the most recent number was about 780 fires so far this fire season, which is a lot more than normal. And the bulk of the big evacuations, I believe they've all gone back. The people in Fort Chip went back in the last week or so. But of course, there have been a couple other fires and a couple other evacuations since then. And the other thing that I should just mention is not only do we have the wildfires, we also had this tornado that tore through Didsbury and Carstairs over the weekend on Canada Day. So it actually remains to be seen, I think, what the government, if anything, is going to do in that circumstance.
And thank God there weren't a lot of serious injuries when the twisters tore through central Alberta there too. Tyler, it appears as though the ousting of Dr. Dina Hinshaw and Dr. Verna Yu ended up costing the province some pretty big bucks here. Now, the Sunshine List, disclosures of public salaries, shows the firings of those two, along with 23 other managers and directors with AHS, cost taxpayers around $4 million?
Yeah, I think the final number was 3.62 or something like that. So a big chunk of cash. And the Sunshine List, as you mentioned, discloses, I believe it's anyone who makes over $100,000 working for the provincial government. And so obviously Dr. Verna Yu and Dr. Dina Hinshaw no longer work for the province, but they did receive severance last year when they were dismissed from their positions. Dr. Yu left in, I think it was May, and then Dina Hinshaw was out by November, right after Danielle Smith took over. But of course, in both those situations, their dismissals were sort of without cause, essentially. Not to get too far down into the weeds of labor law, but they were entitled to severance on account of the fact that their contracts or their jobs were terminated. And obviously, that's a similar situation for the other people who lost their jobs as well. So at the end of the day, while this was a move that a lot of Albertans, particularly Conservatives, applauded, it did end up costing the government a pretty penny.
Alberta had new overdose numbers released recently here, Tyler, and I know they're not very good. Alberta saw 179 people die from a drug overdose in April, making it the worst month on record. Is more help coming for those who are battling addictions here in our province?
Yes and no. So yes, in the sense that the government has spent a lot of money on its building recovery centers, things like that. And the province does say that's the strategy they're sticking with. The no side of the equation probably comes more when it comes to some of the harm reduction stuff that's talked about. Safer supplies, an experiment that British Columbia is doing right now. Can you prevent an overdose from a sort of unknown quantity of street drugs by providing people with pharmaceutical grade drugs that may not kill them, is sort of the essence of street safe supply, which has been very, very controversial. And that's sort of the big one that people are talking about right now. But the Alberta government is not going down that road. Danielle Smith has been unequivocal, saying that Alberta is not going to pursue a safe supply strategy to try and tackle overdoses. So there's the recovery side, the treatment centers, things like that are being constructed or built or developed. But there's also this other part of it, which she had floated prior to the election, which was involuntary treatment. So could a person be forced into drug addictions treatment by the government, by the police, essentially by a judge is what it would end up being. But this requires legislation, and obviously the legislature is not sitting. So we have not seen any, sort of legislative or regulatory movement towards such a scheme. And if it happens, of course, there's going to be the inevitable constitutional battles over whether or not it's legal to actually do so. But those are sort of the strategies that the Alberta government is sticking to. they've touted this strategy as a success for a long time, and it's been picked up, by Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre in particular, who's really boosted this strategy. And we do have a blip on the radar in April that does not look very good for that strategy. But of course, who knows? Maybe it will start working. Maybe the numbers will come down. It's just hard to say.
No easy answers for the opioid crisis taking place in so many cities in our country here, Tyler. Alberta's fiscal update, however, looks pretty good. Our province's new finance minister, Nate Horner, says, things are shaping up. The province has been able to pay down around, $13 billion in debt and even put aside a little money for the Heritage Savings Trust Fund.
And I think it's actually more than a little. I think it's something like a tenfold increase, assuming I had my numbers right when I looked at it the other day. What I was watching for on this fiscal update is whether or not it would actually be looking good, because back in the budget in March, I guess it would have been, the province was sort of banking on a barrel of oil going for about $79 US. That was the average that they expected for 2023, and they based their calculations on spending on the royalty revenues from oil at that price. And it actually hasn't been quite that high. It's been more like US $75 a barrel. And then on the day of the fiscal update, it was below $70 a barrel. So you put those numbers together and you say, oh gosh, well, is the province actually looking at a shortfall in terms of royalty revenue that's expected for its spending? So that's actually the big question right now, and it's a bit of an open question actually, because the finance minister Nate Horner, who took over from Travis Taves, who didn't run in the last election, he didn't answer the questions about it. He said, look, we're going to wait until the end of the fiscal year, which is, I believe, at the end of August, to sort of deal with the consequences of that, or to at least talk publicly about it. So I think it's fair to say that that's an open question right now. Just how good Alberta's fiscal position is. I mean, it certainly seems good from what we heard in the update, but you do have this this little gap in the numbers that could cause a little bit of trouble at the end of the summer here.
Back when Kenny was Premier, we saw him go down to the States quite a bit, encouraging investment here in Alberta. There's also the Alberta's Calling campaign, getting more people from Toronto and Vancouver to come here, bringing a lot of their skill sets. So a lot of the initiatives that Kenny rolled out, are you seeing Danielle Smith embrace them, or kind of backing away from them and coming up with her own game plan?
Well, I don't think we've seen a whole lot in either direction. One of the things that's been a bit maybe odd or interesting anyways about the first sort of month that Danielle Smith has been in power is she hasn't done a ton. There haven't been very many huge announcements. She hasn't held very many press conferences. So in terms of most of those programs, I think it's safe to say that unless they've quietly canceled them and we just don't know anything about them, they're sort of still operating sort of quietly in the background. The international sort of relationships that you mentioned are actually quite an interesting one, because Sonia Savage, when she was the energy minister, developed a number of very good relationships, particularly in the United States. We had I think it was Joe Manchin who was up here and toured some of the oil sands sites last year, I guess that would have been. So there were all these sort of relationships that Minister Savage had built up. And of course, she's no longer the energy minister. She's in education now. So I do think that, in terms of some of those initiatives, there's a little bit of groundwork that this government's going to need to do in terms of being present for discussions, being present for conferences, and sort of rebuilding and working on some of those relationships. But it does feel strangely quiet, actually, I would say, for the first sort of month. You remember when Jason Kenney came in 2019, it was just thing after thing after thing. It was just nonstop. And that does not quite seem to be the way that the Danielle Smith government is approaching its first 100 days, if we want to use that sort of cliche.
Now, speaking of relationship building, where do we stand right now between Premier Danielle Smith and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau?
Well, I believe they're actually having a meeting this week, or perhaps early next week, to talk about energy and oil and gas and things like that. Now, there was a meeting in the last week or two between Premier Smith and some federal government ministers, Dominic LeBlanc, the Intergovernmental Affairs Minister, I believe, and Jonathan Wilkinson, the Natural Resources Minister. And the outcome of those meetings seemed to be largely positive. Politicians rarely come out of a meeting and say it went horrible and they hate each other and wish they'd been able to throw a cup of coffee in their face. But so take what you will from people saying that they went well. But it does seem like there's always the rhetoric of politics, the rhetoric of a campaign. But at the end of the day, they do sort of need to work together for the next however many years, and so. It remains to be seen whether or not some of the controversial initiatives the federal government is embarking upon, namely its sustainable jobs legislation, which is the sort of rebranded Just Transition Plan, whether or not there's any changes to that due to pushback from the province. But I mean, on the other hand, we also haven't heard anything in the last month or so about the firearms stuff that Smith made quite a bit of noise about prior to the election. We haven't heard anything about the Sovereignty Act, at least that I've noticed. So maybe it's just summer and people are too busy enjoying the sunshine to fight with Ottawa, or maybe they're formulating a plan to actually get some things done. It's a little bit hard to say.
Fireworks not just in Canada Day, but maybe we'll have more fireworks in the fall.
Exactly.
He's our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent for the National Post, Tyler Dawson. Thanks so much for joining us today from Edmonton.
Thanks for having me, Hal.
Well, getting married is a very exciting time for most couples. However, once the honeymoon period is over and real life kicks in, marriages often run into relationship difficulties. Our guests today have some advice to share on this topic. We're joined by Brad and Marilyn Rhodes. Brad is a former lawyer and now a marriage pastor, while Marilyn is a former counselor. And together they have authored the book called The Grace of Marriage. They join me now from Kentucky. Welcome to Bridge City News, Brad and Marilyn. Great to have you on today.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us. Absolutely. Okay, so it sounds like you guys are the best people to go to for some marriage advice here. So first off, what sparked you to write this book and what makes it different from other marriage books that are out there?
Well, I would say what sparked us to write is just the need for people to build their marriage on the foundation of the grace and forgiveness of Jesus. Because we've seen, we know personally, and everybody we know, everybody struggles at some level. And if grace and forgiveness isn't primary, one person's struggle is going to derail the marriage. And then it's on a roller coaster based on how well both parties are doing. But the foundation of the grace of Jesus is solid, it's consistent, and it's never changing. It allows your marriage to be solid and stable and grow through all seasons.
Well, as you mentioned, until you get married, and then the courting and the dateship can be great, but then often once we get married, that's when the problems start. And that's because we see each other close up and none of us are perfect. We've got this flesh we're still battling. And so when we got married, yes, the honeymoon was over before the honeymoon was over.
Our first fight was at our wedding reception.
Yes.
So yeah, we did. Yeah, it's like we didn't have any fights in dating. Then the wedding reception, grouchy, irritable Brad decided to show up for the first time. So and she didn't like that guy as much as the guy she dated. So.
Yes, and we just naturally fall into this. We just think marriage should be easy, and we think it shouldn't be work, but we realize everything else in life is work. But then we're just floored when it's not just going along smoothly. And that was how our first year kind of started, because we get in this, performance-based trap. And that's why we talk about grace-based versus a performance-based marriage. But we were on a roller coaster. I was getting my counseling degree and thinking, if I don't tell him everything he's doing to bother me, he won't know, and we'll get in these bad patterns. And I had these huge expectations of him, and he wasn't delivering on those expectations.
I made it easy for her not to rely on me.
He was building a law practice. I was crying a lot, and it was a roller coaster, because my joy was based on how good or not good I thought he was meeting my expectations or how he was treating me. And it was really a train wreck. And about a year in, the Lord showed me that I'm your hope, not Brad. And it's not about what he can do for you. It's about, what am I calling you to in marriage? So I think that's a huge piece of getting grace is, okay, while I was a sinner, Christ died for me. And that's how I'm called to love my spouse, not what they can do for me.
That's amazing. You had mentioned there, Marilyn, the contrast, so that performance-based and grace-based marriages. So how would you contrast those two, maybe? What's the
Well, a
difference?
performance-based marriage is really dependent on the performance of both parties. So if like, say I'm cold, say I'm stressed at work, having a hard day, and I come home and I'm distant and detached. In a performance-based marriage, Miriam withdraws from me. She's not nice to me. She's like, if you're going to treat me that way, I'm just going to withdraw from you or give you a consequence. Like how she treats me is dependent on how I'm doing day to day. And so it's based on performance. In a grace-based marriage, it's just, I love you. I love you when you do well. I love you when you don't do well. I love you when you're struggling. I love you when you're thriving. And my love and kindness and pursuit and desire for you, it doesn't go up and down based upon your day because it's based on the grace of Jesus. And I offer my love to you as a free gift of grace, not as a reward for what you did or didn't do. Now, we make it real clear that doesn't mean tolerating abuse or infidelity. Protection needs to be primary there. But in the day-to-day struggles, it's just we're going to take a posture of pursuit, not a posture of not an offense mentality, but a rescue mentality. So if I'm if I had a hard day and came home and was just a little withdrawn, Miriam get upset at me, withdraw from me. When we got grace, I come home stressed and withdrawn. She pursues me. She's kind to me. She loves me.
Well, and the difference between a performance-based and a grace-based, you just get over things so much faster because we're still going to struggle, but you can struggle and the next day you laugh about it. Where before in a performance-based, you start struggling, you're going to struggle long because you're going to distance yourself and then you're probably not going to come together physically and that's going to create more distance. And then you can go weeks where you're struggling with each other, where when you get grace, you can.
Yeah, most couples live with a low level of annoyance or animosity that just kind of lives in that marriage. And a grace-based approach is the only way to kill that frustration, to kill that animosity, to kill that kind of, we're both kind of annoyed deal that's going on in a lot of marriages.
And it really is kind of loving the other person, right? Because love is kind of an action, right? It's not about how you treat me first and about how I feel today or how you feel today. That's a great example, absolutely. Now, in your book, you do write about your amazing courtship and engagement, but then things shifted to a very different picture of your first year of marriage, as you were just kind of explaining a little bit. So do you want to dive into that a little bit more as well?
You want to?
Well, I pursued Marilyn hard in dating. I mean, at one point went out on a date 24 nights in a row. I mean, I'm a compulsive guy. So, but as soon as we got married, literally Marilyn says like the fire hose got shut off. You know, it was like romantic Brad disappeared and budget man showed up in the house.
You were probably exhausted.
Yeah, it's like no, but she's like, you know, I kind of had an expectation of marriage based upon how I treated and pursued her in dating.
Absolutely.
And I made the mistake a lot of people make, that when marriage occurs, the pursuit's over. And marriage should be a lifetime pursuit, a lifetime of growth. And I just kind of thought, we're crazy about each other. We had great dating. We really mesh. We'll get married and we'll just be fine. It'll be great. And then I took my foot off the gas pedal and man, the car stopped quick. I mean, went from her favorite person to her least favorite person in about 6 months. And it's just because I went from trying to be super kind to just not paying attention to her. Would you add anything to that, babe?
No. And a lot of sports. We came from such different backgrounds, and him from a huge sports family and me not at all. And, you know, early on I was fighting to get him not to watch sports. He was fighting to watch as much sports as possible. And then when we got Grace, he's trying not to do so much sport, and I'm trying to encourage him to go to an event. I mean, it's just moving from that.
She would when I got home, she would try to like keep me from the couch and keep TSPN off. It's like, you know, it's like, can I divert him on a walk? And I was like, you know, it's like somehow strategizing to keep me, because once I lock in, that was kind of gone for the night.
Yes. So it's the grace piece. And then too, we talk about the intentionality piece was a huge shift too. We knew that, okay, marriage just doesn't happen. Everything in life that matters, it takes intentionality to thrive, and our marriages are no exception.
And we challenge people in the book. Like, you're living with somebody every day. It just makes sense to make it fun and to make it good. And just to settle into some boring functional coexistence, it's not God's best, and it's just not good. So if you've got something that's important in marriage, date, invest money, enjoy one another, prioritize the physical relationship. We find so many couples don't have a growth mentality in marriage. They just find this norm they can tolerate, sit in it, and do their life there. And that's just, we've learned it's so much better than that.
Mm-hmm. I'm just curious how you came about learning that. I mean, let's face it, life can be stressful, marriage can be stressful. We all have these busy schedules and pressures of jobs and personal, not to mention personal preferences, like you were saying, sports versus not. And all of this can obviously create that major discord for couples. So what are some practical ways that people can maybe alleviate some of those stressors?
Yeah. Outside our relationship with Christ, and that's really the fuel to be able to extend grace. But other than our personal walk with the Lord, the number one best thing we do for our marriage is go on a date once a week. Once we got through that first hard season, we had couples telling us, you've got to make time for your marriage. And we started going on a date and prioritizing our marriage, because life will squeeze it out. Activities, like you said, life's busy. Our technology will squeeze out the relationship. I mean, crisis in life, hard things that hit, but through all of that, we have 5 children, so that keeps you a little busy. But before we had kids, we started going on a date on a weekly basis, and investing in that time and continuing in that path has been huge for our relationship.
Yeah, it's kind of spending time together in marriage is kind of like going to the gym for your health. I mean, if you do it on a consistent basis, you tend to be pretty healthy. If you don't, you tend not to be. So couples that really make time for their marriage and spend significant time undistracted alone, they do pretty well. And those that don't. And all our dates aren't pretty at all. It's just a commitment. We love each other. We love our marriage. Good date, bad date, sad date, cry date, whatever date, we're going to spend time together every single week. And if couples will do that, it will pay off in their marriage. Scripture talks about sowing and reaping. It's a real deal.
Yeah. And a bad date is better than no date. That's one thing we like to say.
It is better than no date, even if it doesn't feel like.
Well, it's kind of like our relationship with the Lord. You have quiet times. Sometimes you walk away and you don't feel like it had an impact, but it's the long haul relationship with the Lord. You're just growing in that relationship over time, and it's the same with dating. And it's okay to miss kids' events. It's okay we're in such a child-centered culture, and it's actually a good example to them, for them to see our parents are going on a date, and it's okay if we miss something, because it shows them the world doesn't revolve around them. So
you know what? Yes, you're
good.
right. I do find that there are a lot of families that do get stuck in that. So I'm glad that you mentioned that. It's true. It's okay for parents to focus on each other instead of the kids all the time. Now, you also talked about like some couples feeling a bit stuck. So what would your advice be to help them get on a path of growth instead of that?
If you're stuck, you have to do something different to get unstuck. So if a car is stuck in the mud and you just keep hitting the gas, it just stays stuck. Something different has to occur to get it to unstuck, whether it's a tow truck, whether it's a push, whatever it would be. So start investing in your marriage and just commit to being unstuck. We're going to date more. We're going to have more fun activities. We're going to prioritize the physical relationship more. We're not okay being stuck. So we're going to work together to cast a vision that's a marriage that's moving forward consistently over time, not a marriage that we're just okay where we are. So when we find the couples that stuck, they just do the same things.
And also, if both couples aren't committed, like if both partners in the relationship aren't committed to getting unstuck, I would encourage the person that is willing to make that shift, keep the focus on yourself. I think we get stuck when my focus is on Brad and his focus is on what he wants me to do. But if I'm like, okay, Lord, how are you calling me to love my spouse? And that's what I'm going to do. That's a picture of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And our marriages are to be a picture of Christ in the church. And this is how we put the gospel on display. So,
and real practically, just write down where we are, where we want to be, and what's our first step to where we want to be, and always taking more steps toward where you desire to be, because it takes that degree of intentionality. And the problem with marriage is a lot of people put a lot of intentionality in a lot of areas in life, health and finances and their work, but then their marriage is just their marriage. But what we want people to do is, my marriage is my most important horizontal relationship in life, and we're going to do whatever it takes to make it life-giving and good.
What if a couple has different faith or they're not Christians? What does grace look like in that kind of a marriage if you're of two different faiths, or does it even matter?
Well, if one's a believer and not a believer, we talk to couples all the time, and you see that where one is, and that's where that person has to just totally know that their hope and their worth and their value comes from the Lord. And then it is, okay, Lord, how are you calling me to love my spouse? And just continue to pray that the Lord would save them, change their heart. Yeah. And if they're in both believers and in different faiths, but it's about Christ, then you can move forward.
Yeah, and also it's just commit to, like Marilyn said, focus on yourself and how I'm going to make our marriage better, and how I'm going to do what I know to be right. Because people find more joy when they're doing what they know to be right between them and the Lord, irrespective of their spouse. So it is difficult. I mean, I don't want to say it doesn't pose challenges when you have two people of different faiths, or one person of faith, one person. It poses real challenges. So you got to give yourself a lot of grace and realize I can't live in just a point of perpetual frustration, and realize my hope is not in my spouse changing. Marriage is not the ultimate source of satisfaction. When people put their whole hope in their spouse changing and becoming what they want to be, oftentimes they end up divorcing, remarrying, and then being stuck in the same problem again.
Okay, well, you know what? It does look like we are unfortunately out of time. It's a really interesting topic that we could go on and on talking about all day. But Brad and Marilyn, thank you so much for joining me today and discussing your personal, marriage there, and your book as well.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us.
Absolutely. Brad and Marilyn Rhodes are the co-authors of The Grace of Marriage. It's available at www.gracemarriage.com. I'm Jeanette Roche on behalf of all of us here at Bridge City News. Thanks so much for watching.